I'd like to invite Stephanie. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie to you. She is an expert in lightweight design strategies with strong focus on synergetic evaluation of experimental and numerical methods to predict structural performance. And as I promised you, on a personal front, she enjoys fishing, mountain biking, and skiing with her family. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Ajit. So let me share this first, and let's check again that this actually all shows up properly.
Yep.
Yeah, you guys can see it's in the proper mode.
Yes, it's coming fine.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, it's my absolute pleasure, and thanks so much, Ajit, for inviting me to present at this event to talk about realistic performance prediction of advanced AM structures. And I really enjoyed your talk right now. So it's really nice to see how some of that will link into what I'm talking about now. Now, just for a brief introduction, I just recently joined Griffith University. And just to highlight a few things here, so we have our Advanced Design and Prototyping Technologies Institute, which currently has a very strong focus on working with medical technologies. That has to do with the fact that Griffith has the fantastic opportunity to interact with our Gold Coast University Hospital here and the Gold Coast Private Hospital on the Gold Coast. It's also a very nice location to be at for those of you that have visited Australia and the Gold Coast. For those that haven't, once the borders open up, please do come and visit, and I'll be happy to host you and show you around. So the work I'm presenting today, though, is related to my past work and mostly over the last 7 years with my fantastic team at Simtech in Singapore. So I'll show which publications relate to what, but I would like to give a big shout out to my colleague, Dr. Stephen Daines, my former manager, Dr. Sharon Nye, and also the fantastic collaborations with NUS and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And then there's some ongoing work that will flow into this as well, because research, of course, involves that is still linked to my previous work at RMIT University. So with that, let me just talk about the presentation outline. So I'll be talking a bit about designing for AM. I don't have to give too much background because Ajit has done a fantastic job talking about topology optimization. I'll be mostly focusing on lattice designs. I'll show you why, a bit of benchmarking and optimization. And then I want to get into our simulations, and here I'll talk about finite element simulations. And when we push boundaries of additive manufacturing technologies, going towards thinner and thinner structures, more complex structures, we inherently introduce defects into our structures. So that means that our ideal simulation results generally predict upper bounds, and I'll show you examples of that. I'll relate that to some typical defects that we see, mostly focused on powder bed AM, and the methodology that we actually use to address this in realistic simulation, as well as some results to show the impact of imperfections. And I'll give you some conclusions and an outlook, again, that links in very nicely with what Ajit was just showing, how we can utilize machine learning in these kind of scenarios as well. About designing for AM, so when we use tools such as topology optimization, lattice structures, and so on, we very quickly enter the territory of bio-inspired structures. And the reason for that really being that when we look at natural examples, so I've shown a few here, the tree structure with some density variations, sea sponges with varying cell size and orientation, butterfly wings with color control, all these kind of structures are based on truss or shell-based lattices. And there's inherent advantages designing engineering structures with those kind of elements. So we can tailor our strength, our stiffness. We have a very high surface area, open cell architectures. So Ajit showed a couple of examples there, and he also talked about lattice optimization. Now, what we see from those biological lattices is that there's generally a significant variation in lattice cell size and unit cell geometry. And if we try to mimic those kind of things with our engineering designs, we very quickly enter the territory of sub-millimeter dimensions. Now, of course, we like to push things as well, right? So, of course, we know technology in additive manufacturing has a laser spot size, so we understand melt pool and so on. We know what the manufacturing limitations are, and we try to push towards that. So with the development of more advanced manufacturing techniques, our designs also evolve. So the complexity will always be pushing the equipment to follow. On the design side, we can do a lot more, and on the printing side, we have to catch up and make sure we can actually produce those designs. Now, what does that mean now if we actually want to predict the performance of these structures? And I'll show you a couple of examples here in terms of benchmarking. So my former PhD student, Lei Zhang, now Dr. Lei Zhang, published a beautiful paper on in additive manufacturing in 2018, showing how these kind of TPMS, so the thin wall structures, how they fail and compress and deform in comparison to some of our more common lattice structures at that point. So they all under compression have quite similar characteristics. So we see an initial stiffness, we see a plateau, and then we see a collapse scenario where the cell walls are starting to impact on each other and we get densification. Now, with these kind of graphs that we have here with Ashby type plots, we can do some ranking of structures. Not quite sure how clear it is, but the wall thicknesses we're looking at here are ranging from about, so as designed and as per weight of the structure, from about 115 micrometer to 250 micrometer. So as I said, we're really trying to push the limits of the equipment. And if we do this kind of ranking, you can see it in the paper, then the D-type shell-based structure performs best. Now, why is that the case? And that's where simulation comes in and gives a bit of explanation. So for a lot of structures, what we can see is localized shear band deformation as structures collapse. And for the best performing structures, what we see is a very uniform collapse mechanism. So that means that we have very little local variations and buckling. We have a nice plateau that keeps increasing in load, and yeah, generally those structures can carry a higher load. So here the D-type just shows very uniform deformation, while G-type and BCC structures, for example, show us localized shear bands. And the simulation is picking that up very nicely. So in case the images don't show that well here, please have a look at the publication and you will see it more clearly there. So we can use the FE simulation, that's the main story here, to predict the complex performance and collapse mechanisms. In the paper, we're explaining a bit how we actually made sure that we're not over predicting the results, but generally what you can see is that there's always a bit of over prediction, and I'll explain why that's the case. Now, I also want to highlight quickly some work by Stephen Daines, my colleague at Simtech, on optimized strut lattice design. So we saw a couple of things earlier that Ajit showed. We've done a lot of work trying to figure out how do general lattice structures with very uniform cells perform against spatially aligned lattices, which is what we see in nature. And we could actually show with our algorithms that were patented that we can come up with spatially aligned lattice structures. This is based on the strain field, and we align the truss elements with the principal strain directions. And we can see in that case that the finite element, or that the experimental predictions increase significantly in stiffness and strength. And we can also use these kind of algorithms for full 3D problems with arbitrary volumes and apply the lattice generation algorithm to that. The nice thing here as well is now that the structure Ajit was talking about supportless. Well, in this case, we would actually utilize the lattice structure as our functional support. So it has a role to play in the optimized, topology optimized design. There's no need to remove it afterwards. So therefore, we have basically a multifunctional lattice here acting as both support and load bearing member. So again, some very nice publications here that you can look up by Stephen Daines as the first author. So again, we actually predict all these things fairly well. The solutions are available. I want to point out that our minimum truss diameters here, we restricted to about 1 millimeter. So that is well within the manufacturing limit of the structure and the equipment, and the FE predictions are therefore in very good agreement. So what happens now, though, if we push that manufacturing limit or the truss diameters, the shell wall thicknesses further to low values? So I want to explain a few things here. So I show an example about the truss lattice, where we have a little Kagome model. We printed this. We have our ideal FE model. Now, if we're loading this to buckling failure, I've shown you a couple of results here. We generally see that the experiment gives a lower stiffness and a lower stress. And also in this case, the peak load value is actually much smoother for the experiment than it is for the ideal model. I also want to point out this ideal finite element model actually doesn't buckle by itself. So for those of you that know buckling, nonlinear buckling analysis for numerical simulation, you might know that ideal structures need a bit of a, don't want to say push, but you need to introduce a bit of an imperfection to actually make this buckle. And that's what we see in natural structures as well. They have imperfections. So here we're introducing some minor initial imperfections, very small, and we can capture the buckling failure well, but we still overpredict the experimental results, and we made sure that the finite element model has the same volume based on weight and so on. For the shell lattices, we see quite similar things. Again, there's a TPMS model here, so a triply periodic surface design, where we produce the ideal FE model. And again, we see a higher stiffness, a higher plateau stress. Yes, we're capturing the failure mechanisms properly, but everything is very uniform and symmetric, while in the experimental result, we do see non-uniform behavior because of imperfections. Now, I think that is the assumption, right? That these differences are due to the imperfections in the structure. What we don't know at this point is which types of imperfections contribute how much, which ones are the most important imperfections to consider, and do these imperfections act in a superposing manner, or do they act in a synergistic manner? So are there certain imperfections that when we put them together, that actually results in a much larger property reduction? And then ultimately the question is, can we choose designs that are quite insensitive to the imperfections? Some typical defects, just quickly want to go through this. Not all of this looked at by our group, but so we have for trusses, if we print, you can see here very small printing diameters, again coming down to about 150 micrometer. We have a lot of radius and center variations, meaning nothing is really straight because of the layer by layer printing process. If we look at shells, thickness variations and waviness, again, we see deviations, we see diameter or thickness, variations, and we even see holes in the structure depending on the printing and overhanging angles. We can see surface roughness. So again, for powder bed processes, our average particle diameter is in the order of 30 to 50 micron. Now, again, these particles attach partially to the surfaces in the melt pool. And you can imagine that when you push the wall thickness down to the order of 100 to 150 micrometer, those particles and their roughness start to contribute significantly to the weight of the structure without actually helping with the mechanical performance. If we have structures that are 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeter thick, this doesn't really matter. But if we push it down to 100 micrometer, it becomes a very important aspect. And lastly, some porosity as well, which is always inherent to the printing process. It's small, but it's still present. In terms of methodology, how do we analyze this? So we're working a lot with X-ray data in terms of image processing, reconstructing the image, density cutoffs that also affect the porosity, and then alignment and transformation to the desired coordinates. We then perform analysis via scripting and automated manners in various codes, looking at local wall thickness and surface normals for the shells, looking for the trusses at the position of the circular cross-section, the variation in the center position, and also the radius variation. And that gives us a database. So that database gives us stochastic information. We can either map directly or in long-term planning to understand our equipment, our materials, our structures better. We want to collect this stochastic information and identify the parameters as a function of overhanging angle, identify waviness, and so on. I want to make sure that you understand that this database will be material, process, and equipment specific. Yeah, so that's quite important. So, but moving forward, again, it can be used for machine learning processes as well. From a finite element point of view, how do we treat this? So if we're looking at trusses, we work with beam models just for simplicity purpose and for easy defect mapping and stochastic variations. So we can map the beam waviness by introducing layer offsets. We have beam elements that are in the order of the layer thickness, so that works, and it's still fairly small computational effort. We can introduce stochastic radius and radius variation. We can introduce porosity by reducing the modulus. We can introduce roughness by reducing the radius. Similarly for our shell structures, so we can here map the shell thickness, a bit more complex because of the surface normal, but we can map this locally. We can introduce stochastic shell waviness. Important here is that if we introduce the roughness and thereby reduce the wall thickness, we have to introduce some surface elements to make up for the missing contact surface. So that surface element doesn't have mechanical stiffness, but it provides contact stiffness for the densification. So that's important if we reduce the shell thickness. Okay, so now some results. What does it actually look like? So I'm showing here the buckling of a very simple unit cell, but this can easily be expanded to an array. So all these truss lattice defects are superposed for the realistic model. You can see as the model is loading up, we're plotting stresses here, that those are not completely uniform. That is because there's radius variation, there's some offset in the radius. So very importantly, what we can see is the yellow line would be the ideal, the blue line, the red line is the experiment, the blue is now the simulation. And we can see that the agreement is much better. The stiffness has reduced, the peak stress has reduced. So we can systematically study the input parameters for defect sensitivity studies here with this beam element approach. We've also mapped the beam elements versus the solid elements, so there's good agreement, but of course the beam elements have the advantage of faster computational time and allowing for systematic variation of our input parameters for sensitivity studies. So that's work that's currently under preparation for publication by my current PhD student, Chen at NUS. Some other impact here that we see for the shell lattices. All, again, defects are superposed, and we see that we can easily reduce the stiffness and the plateau strength by introducing the defects I mentioned. What we can also see is that the experimental results are much more closely followed in terms of unsymmetric failure mechanisms compared to the ideal finite element model. And again, we can do sensitivity studies via our shell element approaches. So a bit about the conclusions here. It is important when we push the boundaries to capture these types of defects. Interestingly, maybe expected, these defect types do not influence each other and therefore can be superposed. So we haven't found any effects of defects acting together in some manner to further degrade properties. And with this kind of work, we can look at defect sensitivity in a quantitative manner. We can rank our shells and truss lattices, and we can also look at the effect of cell scaling. Now, as an outlook, I just quickly want to show something here about machine learning. I haven't talked at all about process improvement. We've basically gone with the defects we have, assuming we will always have some defects. We can use machine learning, and we've done that here. Again, Chen has published this in Additive Manufacturing this year. We can use artificial neural network training to compensate for truss lattices being not perfectly round in printing, depending on overhanging angles. So we've shown here that, again, with X-ray data collection, we can come up with the overhanging angle. We can determine the non-elliptic, or sorry, the non-roundness and the error in the area compared to the original print design, and we can use machine learning to compensate or come up with free-form compensated designs that we can fit into SolidWorks and slice and actually print. And if we do that with this kind of compensation process, we can actually cut out a lot of process optimization, especially for small scale structures. We hit our design targets much more easily, and we can also improve the roundness of our structures. So yeah, so machine learning has a lot of applications in the future, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of that. And with that, I would like to thank you. I've run a tiny bit over time. I was supposed to leave some minutes, apologies. If you have any questions, we don't get to it, please contact me. Email address is s.feih@griffith.edu.au, but I'm sure we'll also collect questions from this event. And again, thanks, Ajit, for the invitation.
Thanks, Stephanie, for such a comprehensive work on lattice structures. I think we can try squeezing in one question if someone has a burning question. Otherwise, the chat history will make a record of it, and we'll get back to those questions to the audience. Is there any burning question the participants have for us? I'd like to ask a very quick question, Stephanie, if that kind of helps answer something that you've kind of teased out in your talk, which is what do you see as the biggest challenge which is needed to overcome to bridge the gap between experimental findings and those of simulation? I noticed you tried combining a bit of both, but I want to understand from your perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
I think the biggest challenge is that people consider themselves either numerical experts or experimentalists. And to bridge that gap between the two is one of the areas that I really like to work in, but it's also really difficult. And I've had, I'm sure, a lot of PhD students who have cursed me for trying to achieve this. And I send them back again to the lab, or I'll make them redo the models again, just to capture the effects that we are seeing. So that to me is we need that generation of engineers who are comfortable in both areas and actually enjoy pulling these results together and doing direct comparisons. But with additive manufacturing, we now have such fantastic tools or equipment to actually realize our designs. There's really no excuse anymore not to actually go and print something, even if you're a numerical person. So I think we will see a lot more of that type of work moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephanie. And I'll have a look out for any questions that come up and forward them your way to be addressed later on.
Great.
Thanks again.
Ajit, if you have time, I just have a quick question for Stephanie.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Hi, Stephanie. Very nice talk. It's really very interesting to see both experiments on modeling. I see in some of your lattice structures, you have micron-sized ligaments. So, and you seem to really consider defects and all that, use stochastic processes and involve stochastic variables and stochastic fields to kind of capture the performance. But are you not considering the scale effects, because you are at micron length scale, and I'm sure there could be size effect. So if it is purely based on continuum description, are you not really missing out something there?
Okay, it's a very interesting point. We've thought about that quite a few times in terms of the grain size. So is what we're doing on a macro scale tensile test in terms of the properties actually really translating into the micro scale? So my argument would be that we're actually still not, if we're pushing it to 10, 20 micrometer, even lower, I would say, okay, other factors are definitely coming into play. At this point, the failure mechanisms, so my PhD student Inam did some really nice work on ductile failure prediction of lattice structures, and he pushed it to about 500 micrometer. And you could show that the failure surfaces still worked, the ductile failure models still worked. Now, that doesn't mean that if we go to 100 micrometer, there might be differences. Yes, we haven't considered this. If we go further down compared to particle size, I think we'll definitely get into that territory. So thanks for mentioning that. That's a very interesting point.
That's nice. That's nice. So I'm assuming that you are just primarily looking at metals, right? For example, if you think of processes like DLP and so on, and even if you print structures at macro scale, and you still see position dependent property variation. So I don't know whether you could consider that as defect, but then I'm sure there is some heterogeneity within the structure, even at macro scale, and probably there could be something else to account for different processes, right?
Yeah. So at the moment, as I said, when we introduce the kind of defects we see, we generally get into the ballpark where we see the experiments. But Zhang Li is listening in as well, and I'll pass that over to him for future investigation, I think, or maybe we'll get around to it again. But yeah, so at the moment, we've definitely looked at selective laser melting of metallics, mostly titanium, some stainless steel, as the main target materials here. But as I said, yeah, other processes definitely. And if you get to, I say, the spot size of the laser becomes low enough that you're basically getting into wall thicknesses comparable to particles. And then it depends on how the particles are actually the composition within the powder particles is, right? So very interesting. Ajit, something for you to note as well with your lattices and your work. So yeah, we definitely have our work cut out for us.
Definitely.